If not, it'll be on the recording. But today's daf in Masechet Bava Kamma is daf Ayin Gimel 73. And we are at the two dots, which are 7 or 8 lines down. And so just a quick reminder, it's a very complicated sugya we're going to have, which is that there was a big machloket, a fundamental machloket between Rava and Abaya about when a person is an Eid Zomim. So remember, Eidim Zomimim are witnesses who come and report that they saw something. Another group comes at some later time and says, you couldn't have seen that thing because you were with us somewhere else on that day that you reported. It might have happened, but you couldn't have seen it. So the Torah has come in, Evan. So the Torah has a chidush, a innovation that we trust the second group over the first group. And we say that since they testified later.
You start again, you were muted before.
Am I muted now?
No.
Oh, that's strange. Okay, I will start again. So that's interesting. Today's daf, again, is Masechet Bava Kamma. We are starting 7 lines from the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph at the 2 dots. So the machloket Abaya and Rava, which will form the basis for the beginning of today's discussion, is when you talk about an Eid Zomim. So Eidim Zomimim, I don't know how you translate Zomim in English, but Eidim who are found to be false, but not false because they necessarily lied, but false because they weren't present, or they were found to be not present when they said they saw something. So two witnesses say we saw Ruvain, hurt Shimon on Monday, and therefore has to pay him. And then other witnesses come and say, you couldn't have seen that. You were with us somewhere else on Monday that was physically disparate from that place. So the Torah says that in that case, you listen to the second group of witnesses. The first group are considered to be false, and they get punished that they have to pay Ruvain what they would have made him pay had their testimony been accepted. There was a machloket, Abaya and Rava, whether that goes back retroactively. So if, let's say, the second pair of witnesses come 6 months later, do you say that for the last 6 months you view the first pair as being false witnesses and therefore everything they've done becomes pasul? Or is it only because it's an innovation that you should trust the second group over the first group, or because of a takana, a pseida de lekuchot, that everyone who relied on them will lose their money? Therefore, you only pasul them mikan ulahaba, from this time going forward, which was Rava's opinion. So now let's try to prove from our Mishnah how this might play out. So we're 8 lines from the top. The Mishnah said, and we're quoting yesterday's Mishnah, Ganav al pishnayim, you steal with testimony of 2 people saying they saw you do that, and tavachu machar al pihem, and then you slaughter or sell the animal based on the testimony of those 2 people, and so you have to pay 4 or 5 times. Then it turns out that they weren't even there. Nimzu zomimim. So then the Eidim are mishalmim et hakol. They have to pay all that they would have made the person pay 4 or 5 times. Now, my love, the case must be that it was separate, right? These are separate activities. So Sheidu al Gneva, on Monday they came and said, we saw Ruvain steal an animal. And then on Tuesday they came and said, Chazru v'idu al tvicha. And then on Tuesday they came and said, we saw him slaughter the animal. And so we're assuming, we'll see why that's a false assumption, that they're separate. The huzmu ala gneva, and then a day later someone came and said, or whatever time, you couldn't have seen them steal on Monday, you were with us on Monday. And then chazru v'huzmu ala tvicha, and then separately, someone came and said, well, you couldn't have seen them slaughtered on Tuesday, you were with us on Tuesday. Now,
yeah, how do I know it's the same animal?
They would have to have testified. Obviously, you can't. If I say I saw him slaughter an animal and we didn't know that it was the same one he stole without identifying characteristics, you wouldn't be able to be mechayev them, right? He could say I was slaughtered a different animal. So obviously, it was wearing a tag. It had some number on it. So, but if it was different days, different testimonies, then Abaya is correct. And the Eidim Zomimim become pasul l'mafreya to Monday when they saw that first testimony that was turned out to be a lie. Then Hani kivan itzami lahu gneva. Once you were make the Eidim Zomim for the testimony of stealing, then Iglai milta l'mafreya. Then it turns out that since on Monday when they testified about the robbery, they were lying and therefore pasul. When they testified on Tuesday about the slaughtering, they were not kosher witnesses, right? We now know this. Psul and Havi, they were pasul witnesses, and therefore we never would have trusted them. And since we never would have trusted them, now with all the information we have today, why would they pay for what they said about the tvicha? Remember, Eidim Zomimim only pay if you would have listened to their testimony and acted accordingly. Since in this case, according to Abaya, Limafreya, it turns out that when they said testimony on Tuesday, they were false witnesses testifying, or false people, they were sha'im. they would have never trusted them, and therefore they would have not been mechayev on the tvicha, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay that. They should only have to pay for the geneva, which is the double kefil. Amri says, well, according to Bava, what you'd have to say, you go into Hachabay Eskinan, you go into Huzmalat Tficha Tchila. That in fact, the Hazama was not that they were not there on Monday to see the Geneva. The first Hazama came and said, oh, they testified on Tuesday that they saw a Tficha, a slaughtering. They couldn't have seen that because they weren't there on Tuesday. So it has to be that the order was the other way. They were first made Eidim Zomim on the Tficha, and then Eidim Zomim on the Shchita, on the Geneva, sorry. Amri says the Gemara, that's not a very compelling answer. Sof, Hihadri Mitzami Geneva, when later on someone comes and says, well, on Monday you couldn't have seen that they stole it because you were with us somewhere else, then Igloi Milta, that reveals retroactively that they're liars. And therefore on Tuesday, the Chias Hadu Atvicha on Tuesday, Psulin Havi. Again, the same question is, Amai Mishal Mi Atvicha, right? So that is a question on Abaya, because if a witness comes and says, a group says, on Monday we saw someone steal, and then on Tuesday they come and say, on Tuesday we saw him slaughter. It turns out that they were lying on Monday. It means that their testimony on Tuesday is meaningless because they're liars, and therefore they shouldn't have to pay for it. It says, you know how you can explain this? It must be where they said the testimony at one time, meaning they walked into court on a Thursday, let's say, I'm making up days, and said, this past Monday, we saw Ruvain steal an animal, and on Tuesday, we saw him slaughtering that same animal. So therefore, it wasn't two separate testimonies. It was one together, and once you made them Eidim Zomimim, and you would accept that complete testimony, once you made them Eidim Zomimim, it turns out that none of it is true, but it's all one group. It's not that because the first part's not true, the second part's not true, the whole thing is not true. It's one testimony, and therefore they can be chayav for all of it. Lema ketanai. We are I'm trying to think where we are. It's less than halfway down, but the smack in the middle of the daf. This seems to be a machloket tanaim from the following bright. Says the bright to the following: Hayu shnayim eidim oto sheganav. Two people testify about Ruvain that he stole a cow. Vehein meidin oto shetavach, and the same two people, the bright says, testify that he slaughtered the cow. Okay. And then it turns out that they couldn't have seen that he stole it on Monday because they were somewhere else on Monday. So they are Eidim Zomimim about the stealing. Says the Braita, Edut shebatla miksata batla kula, right? Since they are not trusted, they no longer can be relied on to say that he stole it. Their second testimony that he slaughtered it is meaningless because who cares if you slaughtered an animal if it's not you stole an animal, right? It's your own animal. So that's what the Braita says. Huzmu ala tficha, right? If they became edim zomimim on the tficha, this is a parallel to our Mishnah, right? So it turns out that they could not have seen him slaughter it on Tuesday because they were not there on Tuesday. But that doesn't have anything to do with their testimony on Monday. Their testimony on Monday is still presumed to be true. And so you assume that he did in fact steal it on Monday. And hu mishalim tashlumei kefil, the owner, the stealer, the robber, Ruvain, has to pay tashlumei kefil, and the Eidim Zomimim, who would have been mechayev for extra for slaughtering it, they have to pay. Hey, mishalim tashlumei shlosha. So that is the Tana Kamma, which is exactly what our Mishnah said. Adds the Braita, Amar Reb Yossi, the medvar memurim. When is it true that you split the testimony and that the stealers, the robbers or alleged robbers pay double, and the Eidim Zomimim pay the extra 2 or 3? That's b'shtei idiot. That is when they testify. We'll see what shtei idiot means in a second, but that's where it's two separate testimonies about robbery, about geneva, and about shchita, about the tvicha. Aval beidut achat. If it's one testimony, and again we'll see in a second what one testimony means, then it doesn't. Then you don't even make the alleged robber pay from the beginning because edut shebatla miksata batla kula. Because if you throw away their second part of their testimony that he slaughtered it, then, and you say because they're liars, because they were Eidim Zomimim, then you would throw away the first part of it as well. Now, that's the Braita. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? One testimony or two testimonies? My b'shtei idiot, my be'edut achat. What does Rabbi Yossi mean? Well, it depends on whether it's two testimonies or one testimony, right? If you think it means, right, ilema, if you're going to say that shtei idiot means two separate times, right? Shtei idiot mamash, meaning not two separate times, two separate groups, meaning b'shtei kitot, right? that they're basically two different groups of people. So one group of witnesses come and say, on Monday we saw Ruvain steal a cow from Shimon. Another group of witnesses come on Tuesday and say, on Tuesday we saw Ruvain slaughter that same cow with the ear tag that said number 300, right? We saw him slaughter it on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, a new group comes and says that second group could not have seen that on Tuesday because they were with us in Alaska on Tuesday, right? And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, okay, so the first group is believed. This robber pays kefel. The second group are edim zamimim. They pay what they would have made him pay extra, which is 2 or 3 times, right? So that's what edut shtei kitot means. And edut and katachat, and then katachat means zeh achar zeh, right? Where am I? Oh, yeah. Shtei kitot be'edut achat means they came together, right? And bekatachat means, sorry, I lost my place. But okay, here we go. Shtei idiot means the shtei idiot mamash with 2 groups, and edut achat means one group. Katachat zeh achar zeh. They came, right, testifying at the same time. We saw Ruvain steal it. We saw Ruvain shecht it, and that's where Rabbi Yossi comes to say, wait a second. Beidut achat, when it's one group, meaning kat achat b'zeh achar zeh, one group right after the other, then right, one group saying one thing happened right after the other. Then ki mishadi agneva, then what the group came and said, we saw Ruvain steal it. V'hadar mishadi atvicha, and then they come the next day and they say, we saw Ruvain slaughter it, but it's the same group of people. So then Rabbi Yossi says, ki mitzamni atvicha, when you say they're edim zomimim and they're not believed because that they weren't able to see the slaughtering on Tuesday, then says Rabbi Yossi, well, then you don't trust them on Monday either. Edut shabatla miksata, since it's the same group, and you're mivatel, the second thing they said on Tuesday, batla kula, you get rid of the whole thing. Vitzami lo agneva, you don't trust them for the gneva on Monday either. Right? Why would Rabbi Yossi say that? Just because a person's established to be a liar on Tuesday, you don't assume that everything their whole life they were a liar. You assume from Tuesday on they're a liar, meaning everyone has a chazakah, has a reputation that they are kosher until you prove otherwise, right? And so it's not how you would look at it. You would look at it and say that we know that they lied from Tuesday, but we don't know they lied from Monday. So why would Rabbi Yossi say that you threw out their whole testimony? Elolav, that can't be what it means. It can't be 2 groups of witnesses or 1 group of witnesses. It must mean, now we're still analyzing this Braita, it must mean, shtei idiot means 2 witnesses, meaning 1 group, but 2 separate times, right? Edut achat, it means 1 group of testimony, one group of witnesses, sorry, ke'ein shtei idiot, like 2, what does that mean? Katachat, it's 1 group of people who come to testify, but they come at 2 separate times. B'zeh achar zeh, meaning they come on Monday and say we saw him steal it. They come on Tuesday and say we saw him sell it. And that's where, if the second testimony is thrown out, the first one is not automatically thrown out. Aval be'edut achat, when it says 1 testimony, it means at 1 time. Bivat achat lo, right? If they come and they say at the same time, we saw Ruvain steal it, and then we saw him shecht it. That is where Rabbi Yossi says it's connected, and if you throw out part of it, you throw out the rest of it, right? Misavru, now we think, we're making an assumption, which obviously is what we're going to attack when we conclude this Braita. We think, says the Gemara, that we are around 8 lines from the bottom, 10 lines from the bottom, the kuliyama, that everybody agrees with the opinion that we've discussed a billion times throughout Shas, that toch kedei dibor kedibor dami, that if you say something within a small amount of speaking, it's called toch kedei dibor, toch, the amount of time of a small amount of speech, that it's as if you made 1 statement. Meaning if you say, I saw it on Monday and I also saw this something on Tuesday, but you say it right after each other, it's 1 long statement. It's not like you said 1 statement, stopped, and said another, even though you stopped. So toch kedei dibor is considered the same conversation, the same discussion, right? And so if that's true, now that we assume all these things, what is the machloket in the Braita between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi? My lab b'hakamiflagi. It must be that this is how you understand the machloket. Rabbanan Savri, look, the Rabbanan say, if one group of witnesses come in and they say, we saw him steal it on Monday, and let's say it's Thursday, right? They come in and say, we saw him steal it on Monday and shecht it on Tuesday. Okay. And then 2 days later, another group of witnesses come and say, there's no way you could have seen that on Tuesday because you were with us all day Tuesday somewhere else. But you could have maybe seen it on Monday, right? So the Rabbanan who say that that's okay, right? Rabbanan Savri, where am I? The Rabbanan Savri, Mikan ulahaba hu nifsal. That you're only puzzle from the time that that thing happened and forward. And kivan de meahi shaita kamitzami atvicha, mitzami. And since the witnesses came and said on Tuesday you couldn't have seen it, it's only atvicha de kamizamni itzum, right? You only don't trust these witnesses for the slaughtering, which they couldn't have seen because they weren't there on Tuesday. But ageneva de lo mitzami lo itzam. Then no one ever said that they weren't present or were lying about what they said they saw about the geneva. And therefore, the Rabbanan seem to say that you would trust them for the first part, and the alleged robber would have to pay kefel, and you don't trust them, and they're edim zomimim for the second part. And that's a Rabbi Yossi Savar, the last narrow line. Rabbi Yossi comes in and says, I hold like Rabbi Yochanan, or of course he's earlier than Rabbi Yochanan. Dilamafreyahu nifsal. That in fact, you go back retroactively, and you
That's
say
a buy.
I'm sorry?
That's a buy, Lemafreya.
Correct. This is a buy. Rabbi Yossi is saying,
He said Rabbi Yochanan.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm correct. Abaya, you're 100% correct. Rabbi Yossi is saying, I hold like Abaya. And again, it's not, Abaya would have to say, I hold like Rabbi Yossi, right? But Rabbi Yossi is saying the same thing that Abaya said yesterday, that limafreya hu nifsal, that an eid zomim is pasul retroactively, and therefore, kivan demiyad ki is hadihu de ifsali. Since the minute that you said testimony, again, the way I set it up is that on Thursday, these witnesses came in and said, on Monday we saw him steal it, and on Tuesday we saw him slaughter it. But they said it together, toch kedei dibur. And therefore, the moment they started testifying, what they were saying was a lie, right? And therefore, since you combine their statement, kivan kiasahadi, the minute that they said testimony, hu de mifsali, they become puzzled retroactively at that moment on Thursday. Ki itzamile atvicha, when you find out that they were lying about the slaughtering, that means that what they said about the stealing is also not believed. Itzamulo, it doesn't mean really itzamu, it means that they're not trusted. Itzamulu nami agneva, right? You also don't trust what they said about the geneva. You don't make the alleged robber pay. Da toch kedei dibur kedibur dami. Right? And so that is one way to read the Braita and say that this machloket of Abaya and Rava is a machloket between the Chachamim who hold like Rava and Abaya and Rabbi Yossi holds like Abaya. Now the problem, of course, with that is that we just said yesterday we paskin like Abaya, right? And of course, we don't generally paskin like Rabbi Yossi against the Chachamim. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, or it's really questionable to have Abaya be in concert with the single opinion, with Dat Yachid of Rabbi Yossi, and not with the Chachamim. So we don't love that approach. And says, well, you're right. We don't really love that approach because the issue is you made the assumption. Again, I just want to lay out the case one last time, even though it's going to be very complicated, right? These witnesses showed up on Thursday and said, on Monday, we saw Ruvain steal, and on Tuesday, we saw Ruvain slaughter an animal. A week later, right, another group of witnesses show up and they say, what are you talking about? We just took a flight back from Alaska, and on Tuesday, you were with us all day long. So you couldn't have seen Ruvain shecht an animal. You might have seen him on Monday. We have no idea. So according to the Rabbi Yossi's opinion, right, you say that the Eidim Zomimim, who now turn out on Thursday to have told false testimony, are puzzled not from Thursday, but from the moment, sorry, they are puzzled from Thursday. They're not puzzled from the time the new Eidim come and say you were with us in Alaska. They're puzzled from Thursday, from the moment they said their testimony. And since they said we saw him steal it and we saw it slaughter it, and you combine that testimony, if the slaughtering is false, the stealing is false. That's the mafreya. The Chachamim seem to say, no. When the new witnesses come and say he's an Eid Zomim, that's from the time they show up, which is a week or two later. And therefore, it's not retroactive, right? Says the Gemara, well, that's only, what you're assuming is that toch kedei dibor is kedibor, is that when the witnesses come on Thursday and say, we saw him steal on Monday and sell it or slaughter it on Tuesday, that's one statement. And if you throw away part of it, you throw away the whole thing. Amri says the Gemara, 3 lines in the bottom, last 3 words on a line, toch kedei dibor kedibor dami, if in fact you viewed a statement, we saw him do X and Y as one thing, it's not true. Everyone agrees with Abaya So Abaye would say that the edim are pasul lemafreya. Hacha, the real question here is it one statement or not? Hacha toch kedei dibur kedibur dami kamifligi. The machloket is, do you say that he made one statement? The Rabbanan Savri that no, toch kedei dibur, turn the page, lav kedibur dami. That in fact, it's not considered to be dibur. These witnesses came on Thursday and said, we saw him steal it on Monday, and we saw him sell it on Tuesday. Those are two separate statements. And so even though it turns out that there are eidzim zomimim about selling it or shechting it, you lemafreya make them pasul. A moment before they're not pasul, only at the time they said the false testimony, and therefore you separate their testimony into two parts. And Rabbi Yossi holds toch kedei dibur is kedibur dami. Rabbi Yossi disagrees on that point, and he says no. If you say we saw him steal it, and we saw him sell it, or we saw him slaughter it, that's one statement because it was said immediately after itself, and therefore if you throw out part of it, you throw out the whole thing. And so the whole machloket is not lemafreya or not. Everyone would agree, according to Abaya, that lemafreya hu nifsal. The question is, does lemafreya extend to the beginning of your statement, or just from the time that you said the thing that you turned out to be lying about, which is the slaughtering in this case, not the stealing? So that's how we read the Bright. Now, we are now at the top of Daf Ayin Gimel 73 Amud Bet, second page. And says the Gemara, that's a really beautiful, elegant explanation, but it doesn't really hold water because Rabbi Yossi elsewhere does not seem to say that toch kedei dibur kedibur dami. Says the Gemara on the second line, B'savar Rabbi Yossi toch kedei dibur kedibur dami. Does Rabbi Yossi really hold toch kedei dibur kedibur dami v'tznan? We have a Mishnah in Masechet Tmura, which is a very important, and we've had this concept many times, where, remember, the concept of Tmura is where you take an animal that's chulin, that belongs to you, and you go to it and you say, I want to take the kedusha of this karban that you've dedicated and move it from the karban onto my regular animal. Let's say you really love your cow. You said, I want to bring it as a karban, and you change your mind, right? And you say, I want to move the kedusha from the cow onto this other cow or any animal. The halacha is you're not allowed to do that. Once something is kodesh, you can't make it unkodesh. But if you say tmura, it actually, the same status extends to the new animal, right? The pasuk says, Hayahu tmurato yiyeh kodesh. The original animal and the replacement animal both are kodesh, okay? So now, let's say a person said, they stood next to their animal, let's say their cow, and they said, I want this cow to be a tmurat olah. I want it to be a replacement or exchange the kedusha for my carbon olah, and also tmurat shlamim, also a shlamim. Now, says Rabbi Meir that you can't, that's impossible. So you go with the first language, tfos lashon rishon, and harezu tmurat olah. You just go with the first thing you said, and it's an olah, divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you can make two things if that was your intent. Im lekach nitkaveh mitchila, if we know for a fact, how we know is discussed elsewhere, but if we know for a fact that that was your intent, that you wanted this animal to be both of them, right? Then hoel v'yefshar lekot shtei shemot ka'achat. You can't, of course, have an animal that is both a ola and a shlamim. Meaning, sorry, if this is what you meant, meaning you meant to say, you meant to say, I want it to be both, then, yes, exactly like I said, then dvarav kayamim, then in fact it is both. Now, how could you have an animal that's both? So Rashi explains, as Gemara does elsewhere, that this animal is now a replacement ola and a replacement shlamim. You can't go bring it as a karban because carbon ola and carbon shlamim are brought very differently on the mizbeach. So what you have to do is you have to prevent it from, you can't work with it, it's kodesh. You wait till it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, you're allowed to sell it. Then you take the money and 50% of it goes to an ola and 50% of it goes to a shlamim because that's what you wanted it to be. But if, that's what says Rabbi Yosef, but im amar tmurat ola, but if in fact you didn't have intention for it to be both, you said, I want it to be an ola, and then immediately, as happens to us all the time, you've changed your mind, v'nimlach, and you said, no, I changed my mind, amar tmurat shlamim, I meant a shlamim, right? We do it all the time. I want chocolate, no, I want vanilla, right? You go to get ice cream, right? So you said that you changed your mind, then you can't change your mind, even if you say it instantaneously, even if there's no time for it. Well, we'll see that in a second. Then says Rabbi Yossi, in fact, you go with the first thing and it's an ola. and asked the Gemara, Avinamba, we asked about this. What do you mean if you change your mind, you can't change your mind? Nimlach pshita. Obviously, you can't say, oh, I said I wanted to give this money to the Beit HaMikdash yesterday. I changed my mind. I don't want to give it anymore. Obviously, you can't change your mind. Amar of Papa, so Rav Papa explained, Nimlach b'toch kedei dibur amina, right? Then in fact, what we mean is where immediately you change your mind. So it's instantaneously toch kedei dibur, which means within the amount of time it takes to say hello to someone, right? Which is what we call instantaneous. So you change your mind instantaneously, and Rabbi Yossi says you can't change your mind. It's an ola, not a shlomin. So I thought you just said Rabbi Yossi holds toch kedei dibur is kedibur dami, that even if you change your mind instantaneously, it counts. So it says Gemara, it's true, but we're sort of splitting hairs here. Toch kedei dibur, amri toch, trei toch kedei dibur havi. There's two categories of instantaneous, right? One category is where you talk about, trei toch kedei dibur havi. Chad, one of them is kedei she'elat talmid l'rav. One is a little bit longer. It's where a student goes to their teacher and says, how are you doing? Now, remember, when a student goes to their teacher, they can't just say you. They have to use an honorific, right? They say shalom alecha, not hello, but shalom alecha Rabbi. We'll see in a second. Or shalom alecha Rabbi umori, right? How are you, my teacher, my master, which is longer than chad kidei she'elat harav l'talmid. One is when the other way, when a more senior person says hello to a more junior person, meaning they just say shalom alecha, right? So that is instantaneous. Say it's one beat, shalom alecha, it's 2 seconds maybe, or 1 second. And the other one is shalom alecha Rabbi Umori, which might be 3 seconds or something. So it's a slightly longer time period. Kiletle, the Rabbi Yossi, when Rabbi Yossi says you don't believe in toch kedei dibor is kedibor, that's the longer one. Kedei she'elat talmud l'rav. When the student says hello to their teacher, which is, our girsa here is shalom alecha Rabbi Umori, which is very controversial. Some take out the word mori, the Rush takes out the word mori, but that's what we have in our Gemara. That's a little bit longer. Denafish, it's a little bit longer. And kedei she'elat harav l'talmud is shalom alecha is just saying hello, which is itle there. Rabbi Yossi admits that there is toch kedei dibur kedibur dami, but when it's the longer one, he does not agree. And so Rabbi Yossi actually does hold of toch kedei dibur, and that's why earlier he felt like it was one testimony together. If you say we saw him steal and we saw him slaughter it. Okay, we are halfway down Ayin Gimel Amud Bet, and we're about to start a new but related topic that's quite complicated. So that's the conclusion of that machloket Abaye and Rava, and we actually don't come up with a great conclusion from the Braita or the Mishnah. As we said yesterday, this is one of the 6 examples, Yal Kigam, where we paskin like Abaye against Rava, and we say Edim Zomimim Limafreya Hu Nifsal.
Would it make a difference if the Edim Zomimim were to say that he stole it and then say he shechted? Because in that case, if you it would mean that the stealing was that they testified to the stealing first, and then that includes anything after, which would include the tvicha. So I'm not sure I understand the question. The question is, does it matter in which order the Edim Zomimim said their statement? If they say he tvicha first in their statement, then they said Geneva, then yes, you could say Lemafreya starts with the Tvicha, and then maybe they wouldn't count for the Geneva. But if they said in their statement, who give the Geneva first and then the Tvicha, the Geneva would be going for, and the Lemafreya would begin from the Geneva, and then you could believe them on both parts.
No, 100%, yes. So I would absolutely make a difference, because if you hold Toch Kedei Dibor is Kedibor, it doesn't make a difference. It's one statement. But if you hold Toch Kedei Dibor is not Kedibor, then it absolutely matters which one they say first. Because if they say, like you just said, we saw him slaughter it on Tuesday. Oh, and by the way, we saw him shechted on Monday. And you hold Toch Kedei Dibor is not Kedibor. Those are 2 statements. But if you made them Edim Zomimim on the Tvicha, it means retroactively, the second they opened their mouth and said that, they were lying in their puzzle. So everything they said afterwards also is thrown out. But had they said the same thing in the other order, they would be believed for the first one until you prove otherwise. So yeah. Absolutely would. Next discussion here at the 2 dots, which is a new thing that's going to carry us into tomorrow, and I think actually the next day too, is a fascinating halacha of Rava. Says Rava, Amar Rava. This is really, when we get all together learning yeshiva in great detail, these are some of the great sugyot. Says Rava, Edim shehukchashu. Let's say you have witnesses who turn out to be false. They turn out to be lying. That's not the same thing as Edim Zomimim, right? Let's say I walk in and I say, I saw Ruvain slaughter an animal of Shimon on Monday. And then the next minute or next day, two other witnesses come in and say, we saw Levi slaughter an animal of Shimon on Monday, the same animal, right? The same tag. So we are contradicting each other. Now, that, if people contradict each other, generally you throw them both out, right? They can't both be telling the truth. But those are definitely contradictory witnesses, and you just throw them away. Now, there are much more complicated cases, which we're going to get to tomorrow. Let's say one group comes in and says, we saw Ruvain borrow $100 from Shimon on Monday. And the second group comes in and says, we saw Ruvain borrow $200 from Shimon on Monday, right? So they're contradicting each other, but they also agree on a certain minimum amount. They both agree that he borrowed $100. We're going to see that according to some opinions, you actually believe both groups for the 100 and you just throw out the second 100, right? But that's a little more complex, but that's hakchasha. Says Rava, Eidim Zomimim are very different. Eidim Zomimim are where one group says, we saw Ruvain borrow $100 on Monday, and the second group comes and says, well, you were with us on Monday, so you couldn't have seen that. So it doesn't mean Ruvain didn't borrow $100. It just means you didn't see it, right? So that's Eidim Zomimim. The only time where the Eidim have to pay what they would have made Ruvain pay is in the second case, where it's Zomimim, not where it's Hakchasha, not where it's contradicted. Says Rava, an interesting halacha. Says Rava, Eidim that became contradicted. Eidim came in and said, we saw Ruvain borrow $100 on Monday. $100 is a little hard to say because you have to say it's the same money. We saw Ruvain steal an animal on Monday. And then a few minutes later, another group come in and say, we saw Levi steal the same animal on Monday. So they are contradicted. And then later, another group comes in and says, you couldn't have seen Ruvain steal it on Monday. You were with us somewhere else. So now, Ulubesof Huzmu, the Gemara uses the example of they saw Ruvain kill someone, right? So then Neragim, you actually punish the Eidim Zomimim, even though they were contradicted before they became Zomimim. Why, says Rava? The Hakchasha Tchilat Hazamahi. The contradiction is actually part of Hazama. It's the first step. Hazama is that you're liars. You couldn't have seen it, right? Because you were somewhere else. Contradicting them is the beginning of that process. And so it's not as if you first contradicted them and then separately made it in Zomimim. You sort of started the long process and you didn't remove them from the category of Eidim Zomimim just by Hakchasha. We'll see this in much more detail. Elish lo nigmara, you just didn't finish it because you couldn't prove they were somewhere else. You could just prove that they were lying. Amar Rava. Now says Rava, how do I know this interesting and innovative halacha? The Tanya, because we have a Tosefta in Masechet Makot, which is a fabulous Tosefta, which makes no sense. So just again, one quick introduction for this. Remember that the Torah says in Parshat Mishpatim, coming up in a couple of weeks, that if a owner knocks out the eye of their slave, you have an Eved Kanani, right? And then you blind them, you beat them up, you punch them in the face, and they get blind. They go out to freedom because that's considered to be, a unacceptable way to treat your Eved. Or if you knock out their tooth, remember, right? Shein v'ayin, a tooth or an eye. If you knock out their tooth or you knock out their eye, you have to free them, okay? Now, what happened in this case is that witnesses show up and they say, Tanya, I'm reading the Brighton now, around 15 lines, around halfway down, a little more than halfway down the daf. Me'idani v'ish we saw Ish Ploni, we're going to call him Ruvain, Shesima et ein avdo. He blinded his Eved. He got into a real rage against his Eved. He punched him in the face and he caused him to go blind. And afterwards, maybe in the same fight, Hipil et Sheno. He then knocked out his tooth. Now, if a owner does that, then we're assuming the Eved goes free once you knock out their eye. And then they're a free man. And if you knock out the tooth of a free man, you got to pay them for their tooth. You got to pay the dentist bills, right? So you've got to let him go free because you knocked out his eye, and you've got to pay for his dentist bills. Says the Braita, Hare Arav Omerkin. The Rav is really, the owner is really happy that you said this. Now, that's going to be a question. Why is he really happy you said that, right? But this is what the witnesses come in. They say, on Monday, we saw Ruvain get into an epic fight with his slave. He punched him in the face, knocked out his eye, so he blinded his eye, and then he knocked out his tooth. Okay? And the owner likes that you say this. Now, I don't know why the owner agrees with this. And then it turns out that they're lying. They couldn't have seen that on Monday because they were in Portugal on Monday, right? So says the Braita, which again makes no sense, Mishamim Dmei Ayin LaEved. They have to pay the Eved the amount of money it costs for an eye, right? Let's say, I'm going to give numbers here. If you knock out someone's eye, you got to pay them $10,000. The eye, you probably have to pay them $1 million, right? An eye is an incredibly valuable thing. Your value changes, your whole life changes. If you knock out someone's tooth, you've got to pay them $1,000, right? A tooth is important, but it's much less important than an eye, and the doctor bills are going to be much less than they are for an eye. Says the Braita, Eidim Zomimim have to pay the value of the eye to the Eved. Now, says the Gemara, what the heck is going on? Hechidam. What's the case? If it's the way that you said it, the lekakat achrina, meaning there's no other witnesses involved, then it doesn't make any sense. What do you mean mishamim demei ayin laeved? You pay the value of the eye to the slave. Bater demafki lecherut demei enu kaboy l'shlumei. Right? What the witnesses came in and they said is, we saw the owner knock out his eye. So what the effect, if they had been trusted, what would have happened? He would have gone free. Now it turns out that they're lying. So they didn't cause damage to the Eved, they caused damage to the owner, right? They were saying that the owner should free a guy who he shouldn't free. So why would they pay the Eved after all their testimony was good for the Eved? The Od, and furthermore, Harei Rav Omer came, it says, oh, the owner likes what they said. Harav minichale. Why would the owner like what they say? They're saying that he's got to set his Eved free. Elalav, there must be much more to the story than we realize. It must be, Kigon, that this group of witnesses are not the first group in the story. There's, in fact, what happens is, this is a great case, so try to get it. 9 lines from the bottom. Atu Beitre, 2 witnesses show up in court who are unnamed in the Braita. And they say, you know what they say? This owner is a violent man, and he attacked his Eved, and he pilat sheno, he punched him in the face, knocked out his tooth, and then he was sima et eino, and then he blinded him. Now, what's the consequence of that testimony? The Eved goes free because you knocked out his tooth. And then he's a free man and you blinded him. So you got to pay $1 million, I'll say $10,000. You got to pay him $10,000 for his eye because you damaged the eye of a free person, right? So that is the basic. Now this second group of witnesses show up. You know what they say? Where am I? I skipped some words. The boy meitivle harav demei eino. Right, the owner would now have to pay this former Eved the amount of money you would pay a person if you knocked out their eye, say $10,000, probably more, right? And now start the Braita. Atu Beitre, we're going to call them Mitziai. They're middle ones. Now we'll see why we call them middles in a second. Right now we only know that they're middle because after them come the Edim who make them into Zomimim, right? The third group. But the middle group comes now, the Amri, and now if you read the Braita, now we're quoting it, they say, oh, no, it didn't happen the way the first witnesses said, that first he knocked out his tooth and then his eye. It happened the other way. Eino, first he knocked out the eye, and therefore you don't pay for the eye, you just have to make him go free. The other shino, and then he knocked out his tooth. The low boy in the meitivle ela demei sheno. You only have to pay him the value of his tooth, right? And so the owner is very happy about this, right? Because, oh, I don't have to pay him so much money, I only have to pay him a little bit less. And then Adim come and say, oh, wait, these guys are definitely liars, right? Because they were with us somewhere else on that day where they talked about this epic fight between the owner and his slave, right? But what happened here is the Kamma mitziai. But this middle group are being contradicted by the first group, right? The first group said, first he knocked out his eye and then his tooth. The middle group came and said, we saw him knock out his tooth and then his eye. They're contradicting each other, right? And that is Hainu Sharei Arav Omer Kain. When we say the owner likes this, the owner wants the second group to be true because he's going to pay a lot less if he only pays the tooth, not if he pays the eye. And then the Braita finishes and says, Katani, Nimtzu Zomimim, turns out that they were never there, the second group, the middle group. Then Mitziai, the middle group, Mishamim Dmei Ayin LaEved. They paid Dmei Ayin LaEved. Now, why do they pay Dmei Ayin LaEved? Right? They are liars. They're not liars, but they're being contradicted the second they come in. Because the first group said, we saw it happen with the eye first, then the tooth. The second group came in and said, we saw the same fight and it happened differently. It was the tooth and then the eye, right? And then they become Edim Zomimim, but still you make them pay. You must see, from here says Rava, Hakchasha Tchilat Hazmana, Hazamahi. Says Rava, this is my proof. that they are contradicted by the first group. So the first group and second group contradict each other, but it doesn't matter. Once they become Eidim Zomimim with the third group, they have to pay going backwards. Okay, they have to pay going backwards. So that is you in fact, you Hakasha is Tchilat Hazama, the beginning of Hazama.
How do we know Zomimim? The first group or the middle group?
The middle group. The middle group became Zomimim, and even though they were contradicted by the first group, the fact is that once you start making them Zomimim, you view the Hakasha as the beginning of that process, and that does not, you don't say, oh, they were found to be liars, and therefore you don't have to make them Zomimim, and they don't pay for Eidim Zomimim. In fact, that's the beginning of Hazama. And that's
we said the third group are Zomimim.
No, the third group make the second group Zomimim.
Oh.
They are the Eidim who make them Zomimim. They're not testifying, but they didn't see anything about, the owner and the slave. Amr Abaya. Now let's read a little bit because I don't want it to be too much tomorrow for Dov, but probably he'll review some of this. Says Abaya, I have a whole nother way of reading the Braita which can change this whole thing. And you know what? The way I read it, says Abaya, is low. It's not necessarily the case you said, and therefore you cannot prove that is Eidim Zomimim. Meaning, says Abaya, I disagree with Rava, right? Because what I say says, or might disagree, that if the second group walks in the door and says, we saw this happen differently than the first group, you know what? You don't trust these people because you can't, if you have two groups that say contradictory things, you throw them both out. And therefore, even if later a third group come and says the second group are Eidim Zomimim, they're not going to have to pay. Because remember, Eidim Zomimim only pay if you would have listened to them and you would have made the chayav based on what they say. But says Abaya, you wouldn't have made him chayav based on what they say because they contradicted the first group. So you would have thrown out both groups, and therefore they're not reliable witnesses, and they can't become Zomimim, right? But the case here has to be low. The case is different. The case is, it is that afchinu va'azminu. The fact is that what the second group did, right, is they changed the testimony, meaning they said it didn't happen the way the first group said, which is that the owner knocked out the eye first and then the tooth. They came in and said, you're crazy. We saw him knock out the tooth first and then the eye. And you know what? Not only are you guys lying, but you weren't even there because we were with you on Monday when you claimed that this whole thing happened. So that the second group said, we saw it differently. And they said the first group is Eidim Zomimim, right? So basically they said, Afchinu v'azminu. And therefore, in this case, the second group basically would be believed 100% because they didn't just contradict the first group. They actually invalidated the first group. And once they invalidated the first group, you don't trust them at all. You trust only the second group. And so therefore they're reliable. And when the third group comes in now, right, the third group actually throws out the second group who would have been trusted. And that's why they have to pay. They have to pay because their testimony made it that they would be trusted. Okay? And Mimai. Now, how does Abaye know that that's the case? And I'm going to read just the first line of Daf Ayin Daled, but leave the rest for Dov. Midaseifa the mepach v'hazama, reisha nami b'mepach v'hazama. Because the next part of the Braita, which we haven't read yet, we'll read tomorrow, is actually exactly that case, where a second group of witnesses come in and they say, it didn't happen the way you saw it happen. It happened the opposite way. And also, you're lying. You weren't there. Because you said you saw remember, just to be clear, the slave shows up and he's missing an eye and a tooth, right? That's the facts. So the first group says, oh yeah, we saw it happen on Monday. We saw the owner knock out his eye and then knock out his tooth. The second group comes and says, look, you were with us on Monday, so you couldn't have seen that at all. But we saw it actually happen on Tuesday. And what happened on Tuesday was the opposite. First, you knocked out the tooth and then you knocked out the eye. So that the second group is not only disagreeing and switching the order, they're actually throwing out the first group of witnesses. And that's the case in the end of the Braita. And therefore, says Abaye, that's the case in the beginning of the Braita too. Tomorrow, we're going to start learning the second part of the Braita to understand what this is all coming from.
Now, you said a few moments ago that the second group makes the first group Eidei Zomimim. But we were saying earlier that Zomimim has to be a second group who testifies that the first group wasn't there. So how does the first group become Eidei Zomimim? There is no Zomimim unless there's a second group. Second group in general are the 80 Zomamim, not the first group. So I don't understand how you said that they make the first group Zomamim.
No, so it's confusing. So I agree. So anyone who testifies, any group that comes in and says, you were not there, you were with us somewhere else on that day, is believed to make that earlier group Eidim Zomimim. The way Rava explained the Braita, I'll go through it again because it's very complex, is that group A came in and said, on Monday, we saw the owner knock out his slave's eye first and then his tooth. Okay. A second group comes in and says, I don't know what you're talking about. On Tuesday, we saw the owner knock out his tooth and then his eye. So it's just contradictory. We don't know what you're talking about on Monday. We just saw something different on Tuesday. Then a third group comes and says, what do you mean you saw something different on Tuesday, you second group? You were with us on Tuesday somewhere else. So now the second group are Eidim Zomimim. Okay. The first group is very believable now that you're throwing out the second group. That's Rava's case. And Rava says that even though when the Eidim, the second group of Eidim came in and said, we saw something different on Tuesday, and you won't really believe them about that because they're just contradicting another group. But still, even though it's not terribly believable, Hakasha, contradiction, is part of Zomimim, and therefore they can become Eidim Zomimim if a third group comes and says you weren't there. That's Rava. Abaye says that's not the case. The case is where the first group came and said, we saw on Monday the owner knock out his eye and then knock out his tooth. A second group comes in and says, on Tuesday, we saw him do it the opposite. We saw him knock out the tooth first, then the eye. And you know what? You guys are liars because you couldn't have seen that on Monday. You were with us on Monday. So in this case, the second group turned the first group into Eidim Zomimim and testified that it happened a different way. And the rule is that you trust the second group because that's just the way it goes. That's the chiddush we talked about yesterday, right? Even though the first group said we saw it on Monday, and they come and say, we saw something different on Tuesday and you were not there on Monday. So that's both. Then a third group shows up and they say, what do you mean second group on Tuesday you saw this happen? You are liars. You were not there on Tuesday. You were with us on Tuesday. And that's where the Braita says the second group has to pay. So according to Abaya, there were two sets who became Zomimim and contradicting in the testimony. Tomorrow we'll see why Abaya says that because the Seif of this Braita seems to have a case that's very similar to that. Hope that's clear. It's complicated. You listen to the recording, and Dov will pick it up from there tomorrow morning. I think at 7:45. Shavua Tov, everyone. Have a great week.